Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links video. Today we're going to be creating a tier list for the current meta since we have just had the release of the latest mini box, the Distant Neo Space, which has brought with it Contact Fusion and some pretty interesting decks. Now we do have the GRF just around the corner, so we'll also be talking about decks that we recommend you take into Stage 2, which is going to be the competitive portion of the event. So if we head over to the spreadsheet and take a look at the data, we can see that there isn't necessarily a clear front runner. We have had a bunch of different decks winning tournaments, 4 different decks in total, that being Elemental Hero, Jointech, Music Princess, and Aqua. We have had 7 tournaments, which is not bad considering it's only been a week since the release of the latest set. Obviously we would like more data, and that's why this is sort of just a first impression, because again, we are fresh off of the release of the new product and the new character. But if we go down and take a look at our pie chart, we can see that Jointech is making up 25.7% of this in total, which is a significant jump up from Aqua and Music Princess that are both tied in second place at 18.9. So for me, the start of this is very, very simple. We're going to go ahead and grab Jointech and slam it into tier 1. This deck is really, really strong. The skill buff it did get a little while ago has propelled this deck into being the top performing tournament deck. The skill being able to discount your boss monsters is such a powerful effect. And as you'll see as we go through the rest of this tier list, most decks that do have that effect to summon out your boss monsters for 1 less tribute have solidified themselves as being a very strong meta contender. This deck is easily able to threaten your opponent's back row with Jointech Rex. We're able to recycle resources back into our deck. We're able to deal with face down monsters between Curse of the Rising Light and Shieldboring Kong, and some builds are also playing Ancient Gear Golem. Curse of the Rising Light is especially good in here because we can use the Jointech Rex to basically force a trap card, because either they'll lose their back row or they're forced to use their back row on the Jointech Rex. Thanks to the update to the skill, they're also able to toolbox their graveyard twice per duel, which gives them an extra plus twice, which is also really, really strong. This deck kind of does a little bit of everything. The only real weakness of this deck is it isn't necessarily that good at dealing with giant monsters. If your opponent summons like a 4,000 or a 5,000 attack monster, this deck can sometimes struggle to get over it. But we can always fall back on the Curse of the Rising Light into Shieldboring Kong combo, which can deal with any threat. So like we say, this deck doesn't really have any weaknesses. This deck is just really consistent, really strong, and if you do draw a really strong hand, you can just OTK your opponent out of nowhere. Definitely a strong tier 1 pick. And the next best performing deck is actually a tie between Music Princess and Aqua. So we will go ahead and talk about Aqua now, since it is the brand new deck. Aqua for me is definitely a tier 1 deck. Everyone thought that this deck was going to be kind of weak after we saw the cards, after we saw the skill. The skill is very powerful. I don't want to undersell the skill. Again, we get a discount on our boss monsters. The skill does give us a plus every single turn. We can set up the graveyard as well, which makes the skill very, very good. But this deck does lack a way to beat set 3. So what we've done is we've seen some people playing Curse of the Rising Light as just a way to try and flip your opponent's guys so we can get towards the life points. We've also seen Abyss Soldier seeing a ton of play, and Abyss Soldier is really, really good, but it's a legend monster, so it's only a one-off. But what we have started to see is players including cards in their deck that put lots of monsters from their graveyard back into their deck. So the strategy becomes, well, if you're just going to stall me out by just setting 3 monsters, I'm going to refill my deck, and therefore I'm not going to deck out very easily. On top of that, I do have boss monsters that can increase my life points, so I can just sit here, bolster my own life points, and keep refilling my deck, and basically say, okay, if we go for this just like stall game, you're going to deck out first, which basically means you have to go on the offensive at some point. And again, I'm going to bolster up my life points so that hopefully you can't just OTK me, and then when you do go on the offense, I can hit you with the clapback and try and push through a ton of damage through your now attack position board. So this deck is really, really powerful. It has been performing very, very well. It's got 2 tournament wins. It's been doing very well in point battles, and in the PGRF run by Raffater also was the most played deck. So I do think this deck is really, really powerful. It's definitely a tier 1 deck right now. I think it could be up for debate which of the tier 1 decks is going to end up being the strongest, but Aqua is definitely pulling its weight. Now, the third deck we're going to talk about is Music Princess. Music Princess is, again, a very, very strong deck. For me, I'm actually going to place this at the top of tier 1. And the reason why is Music Princess is a lot more explosive than the other decks. I think Music Princess has a higher ceiling than a lot of the other decks. It's just it doesn't always hit that ceiling. And because of that, sometimes it can feel a little bit underwhelming compared to the other 2 decks. But I think if you have a good pilot playing the Music Princess deck, you have all the tools you need to kill your opponent through pretty much anything. By going into full Orchestra, we're able to pop our opponent's back row, which is really, really powerful, as well as gaining a load of attack off of it. At the very least, we'll force out their trap cards on the summon of this monster, which means then when we do our follow-up plays, they won't have the traps to hit our other fusion monsters. This deck also has Divine Breath, which can become a 6,000 attack piercing monster, which is just an insanely high amount of damage. The deck now also has Turbodish in action. Turbodish is able to just get you a +1, which is already fantastic to begin with, and it also lets you set up your hand to do interesting fusion plays. Action is a really strong card that can reduce the attack and defense of an opponent's monster by 2,000. If we're able to summon 2 in a single turn, we can make that 4,000, which when you just consider how much power we have, we can get rid of all the opponent's back row, we have easy piercing access, and we can reduce our opponent's attack and defense. This deck just seems to have a little bit of everything. And that's not even mentioning the fact that we can play 3 Ballet, which is effectively Miracle Fusion. Being able to have a 1 card from our hand and immediately summon out one of our really powerful boss monsters is insanely powerful. So this deck, in my opinion, is probably a little bit better than the other two, but I would expect in the GRF, the top 100, to be populated by mostly these 3 decks. So the next deck we're going to talk about is Neos. Neos has had 2 second place finishes, but hasn't quite managed to win a tournament yet. Overall, I think this is going to solidify it as a tier 2 deck, probably the top of tier 2. This deck is reasonably strong. I think a lot of people, again, thought this deck might be a little bit underpowered because it does struggle to beat set 3. But much like Aqua, players have started experimenting with Curse of the Rising Light to be able to just flip monsters face up. And once they're flipped face up, we can pop them with Pulse Neos, which is just such a strong effect. This deck is able to break pretty much any board, because if they have level 9 and lower monsters, we can just pop them with Pulse Neos. If they have big, high-level monsters, we can summon out Heat Neos, boost its attack, and attack over them. This deck is quite competently able to make 2 contact fusions and then end on a vanilla, whether or not that's a Sparkman or a Secret Order into a vanilla Elemental Hero Neos. We're still able to make those boards relatively easily. The skill is also a lot better than I thought it was going to be. Just discarding cards and drawing cards is quite nice on its own, especially when we want to set up the graveyard anyway. But we also can get back that Hero Descent from the graveyard, which can combo in to allow us to make all of our plays. Because the Hero Descent actually ends up being the glue that holds this deck together and allows everything to work exactly as we need it. This deck does have a little bit of a shortcoming in that if we look at our opening hand and it's all spell traps, we can't really do a lot. And this is a deck that does play a ton of spell traps compared to other decks, so we just have to hope that we don't brick, but when we don't brick, the deck performs quite well. So the next best performing deck is Seven's Road, and this is a deck, again, that has had a second place finish, but hasn't really managed to claim any tournament wins. This deck has been around for ages, and I still think this is a tier 2 deck. This deck still does the same thing it's always done, right? We're able to do the same combo lines we've always done. We're able to almost always end on a Charmy Witch and a Seven's Road Magician, unless we get very unlucky. We're still able to get a massive ton of damage through, because even if our opponent sets 3, we can flip one of them up, pierce over another, and hit over for like 3,000 to 5,000 damage, which is just so much. This deck also plays just a ton of back row hate, which means we can just pop all of our opponent's pesky traps out of the way, and usually we don't have to worry about them too much, which just makes this deck feel like it's very versatile. Because of the way the skill works, this deck also almost never bricks, which is a really big plus if you're planning to take it into something like the GRF. And the next deck on our list is going to be Elemental Hero. Elemental Hero is a deck that did win a tournament, but this deck still has the same shortcomings it's always had, which is outside of doing the double Shining Flare Wingman OTK play, the deck can feel a little bit lackluster. Now we still do have Burst Wingman, which is still a respectable boss monster. We can still pop our opponent's back row, we can give itself a boost, put up to 31, which is all still pretty good. The issue is a lot of other decks have this sort of access as well. Jointech have an easy way to pop back row with Jointech Rex. Music Princess can go into full orchestra and easily threaten your opponent's back row. So just threatening your opponent's back row isn't really enough anymore. So this deck becomes, how quickly can I summon out 2 copies of Shining Flare Wingman? And when the deck does that, and again doesn't have to deal with the opponent's trap cards, it feels very powerful. But when it doesn't end up doing that, the deck can feel a little bit underwhelming. Now again, this is a deck that makes really good use of the Elemental Circulation package, which is absolutely insane. I think if Elemental Circulation wasn't in this deck, it would be so much worse. And the same kind of goes for Neos as well. That card is doing so much heavy lifting for allowing us to dig through our deck and find exactly what we need, as well as setting up the graveyard. So really, Elemental Circulation is probably carrying this deck quite a lot. Next up, we're going to be talking about Red Boot or High Tech Dragon. This deck has performed okay. It has had a couple of top 4 finishes. The deck has been performing to a okay degree. But for me, this is going to go into tier 3. So this deck has just got a new tool in a new contact fusion, being Concurrent Dragon. This card is pretty strong. Being able to make it without having to use a fusion spell can be really, really powerful. Putting the cards back into the deck can be useful. Most of the time I think we would rather have those monsters in the graveyard. But more importantly, if we do discard a level 7 monster while we have this card out, it gains 1500 attack and can make 2 attacks on monsters. So what players have started doing is playing the Pierce spell card to just make this effectively 9000 piercing damage, which will OTK through just about anything. Now there are going to be some extraordinarily high defense boards this won't get a kill through, but for the most part this is going to kill through any standard board. So effectively, this deck has gone from, okay, we're going to have this one OTK line that will almost always kill unless you have a trap card to stop it, to now we have 2 different OTK lines, and we can now pick which one we want to go through, or tailor our play based on whether or not we have Red Boot, or whether we have Blue Fang in the hand. Now that being said, even with this new OTK line, we still lose to the same cards. We still lose to Compulsory Evacuation Device, we still lose to Negate Attack, we still lose to Shiny Shady. So this deck does feel like a bit of a glass cannon, where if the combo works, you just OTK your opponent. They probably don't feel particularly great about it, but if your opponent does have a trap card that stops this deck, again, it just crumbles, and unfortunately, you will just lose. So for me, this goes in tier 3 because of how unreliable it can be. And the next best deck is going to be Baseball. Baseball is an interesting deck. I personally do rate this a little bit higher than the Dragons. And the reason why is this deck is a little bit more consistent in my opinion, as well as has the ability to play through more common back row. This deck's combo is effectively we use Dragonic Pressure to wipe the board, then if able, we will activate 2 copies of Secret Order, bring back 2 Volcano Attack Dragons, and attack our opponent for 6000 damage. Now the main difference between what this deck is doing and what the high-tech Dragon deck is doing is that we're summoning normal monsters, which means our opponent's Shiny Shadies aren't going to work on us. And that does give this deck a bit of a leg up, because the more that we see Shiny Shady being played, the more that this deck is going to be able to take advantage of the fact that it doesn't work against it. So effectively, both of these decks do a very similar game plan. You just want to do your combo, OTK your opponent, and hope their back row doesn't stop you. But I do think that the Baseball deck is going to have a better time doing this, because less people are going to be playing the trap cards that stop it, that big Negate Attack and Slime. Now I think we will start to see more Negate Attack come in, because I do think Negate Attack is a really good deterrent to specifically the Aqua deck. But I don't think we're going to see an uptick in Slime. We might do, but Slime does feel a little bit lackluster when we do have decks like Join Tech, and we do have decks like Music Princess that can easily pop it before we even get to the battle phase. Next up is Yammy Gradius. Now this is a weird deck. So this is a deck that was piloted by Voltalon, and this did get 2nd place in a tournament, but this for me is going in High Rogue. Now you might be wondering, why is this going in High Rogue if it took 2nd place in a tournament? Well, because Rogue decks typically are decks that can do really well in the current meta because they have specific counter picks. So the reason this deck works so well is because of Yammy Ruler. Yammy Ruler being able to floodgate your opponent stops them from tribute summoning. And notably, we do have 2 decks in tier 1 that very, very much rely on tribute summoning to do anything. Therefore, Yammy Ruler is a really good anti-meta pick right now, but if you're not going to run into exactly one of these 2 decks, you could be in a bit of trouble. So it does sort of stop Music Princess, but Music Princess doesn't, strictly speaking, have the tribute summon. They can use the Ballet to fuse from graveyard, so if they can just dump a load of cards in their hand into the graveyard, again, they can just fuse from there, so it's not really a big deal. They also have things like Turbodish, which you can just summon underneath Yammy Ruler, which is just another way to just play through it. So it's really, really good into some of the best decks, but also really, really bad into a lot of the rest of the field. Now, this deck also plays a bunch of the Gradius cards, and the Gradius cards are pretty good on their own, but the Gradius cards can feel a little bit inconsistent since they don't really have a powerful skill that they can make use of, since their skill just adds 3 extra deck monsters to the extra deck. And then the last deck that we've seen with top 4 finishes is going to be Metarian. Now this deck only has 1 top 4 finish, but I do think the deck is respectable enough that we're going to have it in tier 3. So Metarian is in a bit of a weird place right now. The deck is reasonably strong, but it just feels like the gimmicks the deck has don't outperform the gimmicks that other decks have. So Ashura Star is still fantastic. You're still able to pop your opponent's face down cards, whether that be a monster or whether that be back row. It's still really good to get rid of face down cards. The deck does now also have Evil Baller, which can change your opponent's monsters to Warrior, for example, so we could gain their attack. Or if Warrior decks are quite popular, which again, they should be, right? We do have 1, 2, 3 decks that are summoning tons of Warriors, 1 which summons Warriors occasionally. So theoretically, this should be pretty good to OTK all of these Warrior decks, but unfortunately it doesn't always end up that way. I do think the Metarian deck is still pretty good. It just feels like it's not as powerful as the rest of the field right now, so it just kind of feels like it's a lesser version of what a lot of the other decks are. So now we're going to talk about the decks that haven't quite managed to hit top 4, and the first one we're going to talk about is Gradius. This is a deck that keeps almost making it. This is a deck that has 6 top 8 finishes, but none of them have managed to squeak into that top 4 spot, which is a little bit disappointing because this deck is really cool. This deck does some really cool things. You're able to summon out multiple Ripple in a single turn, reduce your opponent's attack by 800, but you can do that effectively 4 times because it's 2 800s per Ripple and you can summon out 2 Ripples. That's just a ton of debuffing. You're also able to pop your opponent's back row using Bomber. You're able to do some really strong advantage plays by using things like Lord British. You're able to go to full custom, just get a 3200 attack Piercer, and then you can copy that attack onto your Gradius option, which is also just really, really good. This deck does so much really cool stuff, but it just doesn't feel consistent enough. Typically, the way that Gradius plays is if you open very, very well, the deck just kind of does its game plan very uninterrupted. You get to do exactly what you want, pop your opponent's board out the way, attack over it. You don't tend to do a ton of damage because this deck isn't really much of an OTK deck, but you get to control the board at an alright pace. You get to get a lot of damage through set 3. You can pick apart your opponent's board, and then that's kind of it. Either your opponent just kills you on the crackback, or they don't, and then you get to finish them off. But if you don't open strong, if you don't find all the pieces you need, if you don't have access to option and multiple, the deck just kind of crumbles and it doesn't really do anything. So this deck I think is really cool and it's really fun, but it's not consistent enough in my opinion to have it anywhere higher than High Rogue. Next up, we're going to talk about Light Galaxy, and this unfortunately I think is going to go down into Rogue. This deck hasn't really managed to do much of anything. I think this deck has 1 top 8 finish and that's it in this format. Last format it was also not doing particularly well. Light Galaxy is still a reasonably strong deck, it's just struggling a little bit at the moment. The deck does still have the tools it needs to be able to do a lot of interesting plays. Again, it's a Secret Order deck, so we can just bring back the Galactica Oblivion. We can go into Plasma, which can pop our opponent's back row. We have tons of milling. We do also have Plora, which can get us a lot of advantage. We're able to go into Glaciar Eve and Fuse Eve, which just have such good consistency effects. The skill is also pretty good. When we do go into that Eternal Galactica Oblivion, and we do get that OTK play, which again can go through defense position monsters because we have Leica, which can give piercing as well, the deck feels really, really strong. The problem is, it feels like we have to spin a lot of plates to get into that situation, whereas some of these other decks don't really have to do that. I feel like Jointech and Music Princess can get to that stage without having to put anywhere near as much effort in, and both of those decks are not as much impeded by trap cards. Whereas if your opponent has a Legend Trap, pretty much any Legend Trap other than Widespread, or a Shady, it absolutely shuts down your OTK with the Eternal, so unfortunately this deck does feel it's a bit in Struggle Street, so we're going to have it in Rogue. Next up we have Royal Rebel. This deck did actually get a 2nd place finish in the last format. This deck can be quite strong, but the issue this deck has, again, is trap cards absolutely destroy it. Now, one benefit this deck does have is we don't really have many mandatory spell traps, which means we can just play a ton of back row hate, which is what a human played who was the player that did pilot this to a 2nd place finish. So if we get rid of our opponent's trap holes, we get rid of their shiny shadies, and we're able to just summon out all of our monsters, get all our Royal Rebel effects off, the deck feels very, very strong. And we are able to do some pretty strong OTK plays by using Hard Rock to yoink a load of attack and burn our opponent, and then attack over a weaker monster on the opponent's board. But if this strategy does come off, it feels very, very strong. The issue is there are lots of ways to play around this, and it's going to feel a bit lackluster if our opponent, for example, gains life, like the Aqua deck. Next up, we're going to talk about Gaia, but this is specifically Heaven Gaia, which is a build that I came up with and a couple of other people did come up with as well. Shout out to Yusuke Mora. But this is a deck that works around being able to attack directly. So this uses the brand new Contact Fusion monster we got, the Enigmatic Princess of Eternal Heaven. This is a 1700 attack monster that can attack directly and you don't take any damage back from battles involving it. Which means if we can make 2 of this card, that will now attack directly for 3400. Then if we're able to summon out the Conqueror of Champions Gaia, that can attack directly for an additional 2600, which is 6000 direct damage. Now the other lethal line we can find is that if we only have 1 of our Enigmatic Princess, we can instead use our skill to grab the straight Pierce from our deck, and then use that to get an extra 2000 damage onto our Conqueror of Champions attack, which then hits for 6300. This deck doesn't need to OTK your opponent because you can just slowly kill them over the course of a few turns, and if we do keep summoning our Enigmatic Princesses, they do sort of insulate us and protect our life points from taking a ton of damage, but this deck does feel a little bit underwhelming. It doesn't have many trap cards, so it can kind of fall over to OTK decks. So there is a lot of weaknesses with this deck, but it is an interesting brew, and I thought I would mention it, but I wouldn't put it higher than Rogue personally. Next up, we have Dark Galaxy, and this is the fusion variant. This deck actually has performed reasonably okay. I think it had a top 8 finish this week, which is not that bad. Realistically, this deck is still not where it needs to be. With only having access to the one Dark Hole device, this deck really does struggle, and especially if you do use that, then we can't use the other Limit 1 cards. The deck still has some plays it can make, but unfortunately those plays are just very lackluster compared to what the other decks are doing above it. Then we have the Warrior Pile deck. We're going to put this straight into the top of High Rogue, because again, this is a Yammy Ruler deck, which means this is a deck that specifically counters Tribute Summon decks, which again, sort of counter the top 3 decks in the format. So if, for example, you end up in top 100 and everyone is just playing these 3 decks, playing a Yammy Ruler brew could be really, really good. Personally, I think this is the best shell to put Yammy Ruler in, because we do have access to the circulation package, which just help us dig into getting the Yammy Ruler, as well as the fact this deck can just OTK out of nowhere. If we're able to stick a Yammy Ruler, we can then summon out a Yammy Luna. Yammy Luna's effect will change Yammy Ruler back to attack after it's used its Floodgate effect, and increases attack by 500. So then we have a 3000 Piercer, then if we activate our skill, we can grab the straight Pierce, and then we can get a 4500 Piercer on the Yammy Luna, which means we now have 7500 piercing damage, which again can be just enough to kill anyway. So I do think this deck is going to be a little bit stronger than the Gradius version, but fundamentally they're both just Yammy Ruler Turbo. And speaking of Floodgates, the next deck we're talking about is Beesteam. So Beesteam is, again, it's very similar to the Yammy Ruler in that the whole strategy of this deck is to create a Floodgate monster that stops your opponent from playing the game. Now this works against some decks, it really doesn't work against a lot of other decks. It is very gimmicky, but if we're able to stick our maximum, which should be relatively easily between our skill and between elemental circulation, we can just make it so your opponent can't play the game. Now, there are a lot of ways that you can out this. A lot of decks can just easily defeat this maximum, and Hammer Shot is the easiest way to just get rid of it. But a lot of decks aren't playing these tools or aren't playing monsters that can beat this card, and not being able to use Special Summon monsters' effects can be very, very detrimental. So this card I think is going to go at the bottom of High Rogue, but it still can just Floodgate out some of the best decks, so it is definitely worth mentioning. Next up is Cyber Dragon. Cyber Dragon is another rogue deck. This is still worth mentioning because this deck did perform well in the last format, and that's basically what we're going to do. If a deck performed well in this format or in the previous format, it is going to be mentioned here. So although there is quite a lot in rogue, that's because the decks were relevant recently, and that's why they're still hanging around. But Cyber Dragon is in an okay spot. It did actually find a tournament win in the last format. It was just in a 15-player tournament, so it didn't quite make the spreadsheet. This deck is okay. I don't think this deck is super strong. I don't think this deck is anything crazy, and I don't think it's going to be particularly strong in the current meta, but if you do get very lucky, the deck can high roll into a win. Then we're going to talk about Mismutton. Mismutton is another one of those OTK decks. It's very similar in a lot of ways to Chrysalis, it's very similar to Baseball, and it's very similar to the high-tech Dragon deck, in that you just do your combo, and then you hope you win. Now this deck is very similar to Baseball in that you're summoning a normal monster to do this play, which means that your opponent's Shiny Shady isn't going to affect it, which is probably its biggest strength. Now, I would say the Baseball deck is a little bit stronger because the skill adds a little bit of consistency, but the Mismutton deck is still just as potent and it can OTK just as easily. And the last deck we're going to talk about today is going to be Chrysalis or Tearfing Turbo. So this is the build of the deck where effectively we're just playing the one spell trap, which is the equipped spell. We want to get out the Chrysalis, mill 3 monsters, equip it with the Tearfing, attack over 3 defense position monsters, and OTK our opponent. It's very, very simple, very, very easy to play, but this deck just keeps coming back. It does keep showing up, and it does keep getting a load of piercing damage in and winning games out of nowhere. So it still does catch a lot of people by surprise. Realistically, I don't think this is going to be a particularly strong deck, but then again, that's why it's in Rogue. So let's talk a little bit about the GRF. The GRF is right around the corner. Stage 2 should be very, very competitive. And if you're aiming for that top 10, top 100, top 500, top 1000, you really want to be playing the best deck you can. So what I would recommend is play whichever deck you've had the most experience with, but is still very competitive. So for me, I think Joint Tech is quite a safe pick. I think the deck is really strong, and the deck is relatively easy to play. I think you're not going to burn out with Joint Tech. You can win games quite quickly with Joint Tech. Now, Joint Tech isn't just going to win every single game. I don't want to tell you play Joint Tech, it's the strongest deck in the game, you're just going to destroy everyone. You will still lose a decent amount of games. But the games will be very quick. There isn't a lot of brain power needed to pilot this deck, so I think Joint Tech is going to be one of the better ones to pick. Music Princess, I think, is going to be one of the strongest decks, And I think if you have a lot of experience with it, if you already know a lot of the lines, if you're very used to the deck, Music Princess is going to be very, very powerful at this event. But if you're not used to it, and if you think you're going to get burnt out by having to think through all the different plays you can make, it's probably not going to be a very strong pick. Then we have Aqua. I think Aqua is a really strong deck. The only problem with Aqua is, again, if your opponent goes on the defensive, you might find yourself playing very long games, and if you are, that could hinder your points per hour. So if you're worried about Danes taking too long, I probably wouldn't recommend Aqua, but if your plan is just to win more games than you lose, Aqua could be a really solid pick. As for the rest of the decks not in tier 1, I think Neos is fine. Neos is relatively strong. Occasionally you'll brick, and it won't feel very good, but I think when you don't brick, the deck is still going to perform really, really well. Spellcasters is a weird one. I don't think I would recommend Spellcasters, but if you have Spellcasters, there's no reason not to play it. The deck is still reasonably strong. You could still take games off of all of these top decks. It's just some of the decks you're going to have a worse matchup against than others. For example, I don't think it has a particularly good matchup into Aqua, but you still can beat that deck. You just have to hope that they don't draw very well. Baseball is a pretty good one-dimensional deck, where the entire strategy is just, I don't really care what you're doing, I'm just going to wait until I get all of my combo pieces, play them all, and then try and OTK you. And I think the deck does that quite well, so the deck might be really, really strong if, again, you don't really want to play a lot of interaction. Then there's Elemental Heroes. Elemental Heroes, again, can be in a bit of a weird spot. I think Elemental Heroes is a deck I would recommend if you've already played a lot, if you already have all the cards and you don't want to go into any of the new boxes. Elemental Hero deck is a fine deck. The deck still can perform, it's just going to be a little bit weaker than the rest. I don't know if I would really recommend most of the other decks. Again, some of these Floodgate decks I think can be okay depending on what the meta is, but it is a very specific meta call. If the meta is extraordinarily diverse in the bracket that you're in, I would not recommend taking one of these decks, because your opponent could just slam down a bunch of cards that are unaffected by your Floodgates and then kill you anyway. But if you do find yourself in that like top 100 and every single player is just playing a tier 1 deck, then these Floodgatey type monsters could be the way to go. But that is it for the tier list. Let me know what you think about these down in the comments down below. Every time I release a tier list, someone always thinks that something is massively in the wrong place. I'd really like to hear about your opinions, and feel free to ask me any questions you want down in the comments. But thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.